Shalom, my friends. Today is the 14th of Aviv. As we enter into this season of Pesach, I have no doubt but that final touches are being added to everyone's preparations. The home has been cleaned, the kitchen and pantry made ready, having been cleaned and explored to find any and all chametz or leaven and leaven-containing products. The preparations, though, don't just end there. For our preparations are not just for the home and the Seder, but our preparations include, or should include, preparing ourselves. We'll explore this issue by exploring one of the traditional parts of the Passover Seder, the Mah Nishtanah, the four questions. The Mah Nishtanah has been a moment in the Passover Seder to which many people look forward with anticipation. You have what is typically the youngest child in attendance who gets up and recites in Hebrew, Mah Nishtanah halayla hazeh mikol haleot. What makes this night different from all other nights? Now, apart from the cuteness of having the littlest one of the next generation stand before those gathered and recite in Hebrew their part in the Seder, a moment of pride and anxiety for parents and grandparents, and for the child, an eternity of anxiety in the moment, there is something deeper going on that should speak to the adults gathered to participate and to celebrate in the Seder. Our first clue to this is that the four questions is really anything but four questions. It is actually four statements. But first, a little history. The four questions come from the Babylonian Talmud, Pesachim, Section 10, subsection 4. They are four statements rather than four questions. The opening question is as expected, Mah Nishtanah halayla hazeh mikol haleilot. What makes this night different from all other nights? Within the Babylonian Talmud, there is a slightly different focus of the questions than what we have today. The subjects of the four statements is matzah, unleavened bread, marurim, bitter herbs, et habashar tzit liesh, meat roasted by fire, and dipping twice. It is commanded to us, therefore, that we should eat the roasted flesh, and to eat the matzah, and to eat the bitter herbs. Now, the Jerusalem Talmud contains these three alone, and there is not the fourth. Remember that with the loss of the temple, it resulted in the dropping of the statement from the Seder about meat roasted by fire, as the Paschal lamb could no longer be offered in Jerusalem as was required. Remember, it was required to be offered and sacrificed where God had placed his name, and that would be in Jerusalem. Sa'adin ben Yosef Gaon, who lived from around 882 to 942, and later Rambam Maimonides, who lived from 1135 to 1204, added the statement regarding reclining to bring the number back up to 4. Now, there's a slightly different order when we look at this from an Ashkenazi tradition. There, what we find is that the order is dipping the food, matzah, maror, and reclining. Now, the Chabad communities, who are Ashkenazic in their origins, have changed back to the oldest Seder, and the order followed by the Sephardic Jews, and it's the one that we use today. And that order is matzah, maror, dipping, and reclining. Now, there's a slightly different order from the Ashkenazic tradition. Their order is dipping the food, matzah, maror, and reclining. It should be noted that the Chabad communities, which are Ashkenazic in their origins, have changed back to the oldest Seder, and they therefore follow the same order as Sephardic Jews, and the one that we use, which is matzah, maror, dipping, and reclining. So the question arises, Is it ma, what, or is it lama, why? Because frequently the questions are all asked as why. And in fact, the why is never answered. The what, however, is answered. Well, as we look at it, it is Mah Nishtanah halayla hazeh hemekol haleilot. What makes this night different from all other nights. So it is a what. When we look at the four statements in the English, what we get are that on all other nights we eat both chametz and matzah. On this night we eat only matzah. And we note a couple of things. First of all, there's a differentiation in each one of these statements of the Pesach night and all other nights. The verses then go on to delineate what is different. And it therefore gives us the answer as to what it is, not why it is, but what it is that is different. So in the first statement, we have both chametz and matzah on all other nights, but we eat only matzah on this night. Statement number 2 is that on all other nights we eat many vegetables. On this night, maror. Statement number 3 is that in all other nights we do not dip vegetables even once. On this night, we dip twice. And statement number 4, that in all other nights some eat and drink sitting, with others reclining. But on this night, we are all reclining. So one thing that should be clear is that the night of Pesach is set apart from all other nights. Question, of course, would be why. The Paschal season actually is set apart from the rest of the days, and that was very clear from the four statements that were made. And it should be recognized that the Pesach begins a season culminating in Shavuot. And when we look at these, we find that this pattern is repeated. The night of Pesach is different from all other nights. The Chag Matzah is different from every other week of the year. There's a different matzah that you have to eat in this time frame. The matzah that is eaten during this time frame is referred to as the bread of humiliation, and that comes from Deuteronomy 16, verse 3. You have the Aviv first fruits, during which a different menkah was required to be offered on that day, coming from the Aviv barley out of the fields, and had to be roasted in order to make that menkah. You have the counting of the Omer. There is no other counting / recounting, because the word for counting means to do both, that is required for the rest of the year. And you culminate in Shavuot, in which a new menkah that requires chametz, leaven, is going to be offered. So let's look at the matzah. So statement number 1 is that on all other nights we eat both chametz and matzah, and on this night we eat only matzah. And again, we have that delineated. When we think of the matzah, most everybody thinks of a cracker-like substance. We call it unleavened bread. And the chametz, which is a leaven or any food made with a leavening agent. But in actuality, matzah just means unleavened. And we kind of add, to complete the picture, in our mind at least, the concept of bread so that we understand what it is. But matzah means unleavened, and chametz means leaven. We also recognize that there's an association with unleavenedness, with righteousness, and with leavenness, with sin. Now, as we look at these two words, we will notice immediately that they have very similar letters. Both contain a mem and a zedi. And in the case of the chametz, we have this leading chet, and in the case of the matzah, we have a trailing hey. these letters are very similar. In fact, when you look at them, they're the two of the letters that most frequently are going to be misrepresented. People will draw a chet as a hey or a hey as a chet, and really it's only this little difference between the two. Recognize that on any other days of the year, except for during unleavened bread, we can eat matzah or we can eat bread. And both of these are kosher. But on Pesach and during the celebration of unleavened bread, we have to eat a special kind of matzah. It's different than the matzah that is available the rest of the year. Natural question would be, why? So when we look at the difference between matzah, which is parv, which is kosher for Passover, and matzah, which is not kosher for Passover, which means that it would be chametz matzah, we recognize that both of these two matzahs are made from exactly the same ingredients. You have flour that's generally derived from the wheat, and water. And there is time. And that is where we get the difference between the two. You see, the chametz matzah is prepared and completed in a time frame in excess of 18 minutes. And the kosher for Passover matzah, the parv matzah, is completed from start to finish, from mixing to rolling it out to baking it to pulling it out of the oven in less than 18 minutes. So the difference is not in the ingredients, but the difference is in the time. Now, the reason that the time is important is because the wheat flour inherently has an enzyme that once it comes in contact with moisture, unless it is baked within 18 minutes, it will enzymatically begin to leaven the matzah. And so thus the difference between the 18-minute or less matzah, which is parv, kosher for Passover, and that which is produced that takes more than 18 minutes to produce, that is not parv for Passover, but is still kosher. And really that's the minutest of difference between the matzah and the chametz. And it's important to recognize that as time progresses, that the difference between the matzah and the matzah chametz is just a matter of time. And so the expectation from a Jewish perspective is that everything proceeds towards a state of chametz, a state of leavenness. And that the difference between these two is very small. Now, when we look at these two letters, we recognize that if we exist day in and day out in this state of chametz, that really during this time frame we need to prepare ourselves and we need to get ourselves to a place to where we are the true matzah and not the chametz. And the question becomes, how do we do this? What does that look like? Now, the Jewish sages look at these two letters and notice a few things. They talk about how these letters are representatives of the characters that people can have, and specifically relating to that difference between the matzah and the chametz. In the case of the chametz, you have the letter chet, you have this roof over the top, and you have the two sides of the house which provide the walls, and the floor is open. And all of us make mistakes. And when we do, we fall through the floor, and that puts us outside the house. But now, because the attitude is one of arrogance, and an attitude where one will not say that they're sorry and won't acknowledge or take responsibility for their mistakes, There's no way back into the house to be centered with God and to be centered in the relationships with others. Well, what about the hay? Here too, we start out with an individual that's centered within the home. And here too, because mistakes and sin are things that all are subject to, when a mistake is made, we find that once again we are outside of the home. But in this case, because one has a humble attitude and is capable of exploring oneself and coming to the conclusion that there's something to say sorry for and to acknowledge it and to take responsibility for it, they're able to enter back into the home and to be centered back with the relationships both with God and with the other people. Well, when we think of how it is that we should be in this time frame of Chag Matzah, we don't want to be a chet, but we want to be a hay. We have to have a willingness to be open to the transformation that God will bring. And that only comes with humility. It only comes with that ability to search oneself and say, you know what, I may be doing this in different ways all through the year, but I'm going to look at myself critically and look at where I might be causing problems and open myself up to God stepping in and changing my heart to transform me. We have from Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 1 to 3, we observe the month of Aviv and keep the Passover to the Lord your God. For in the month of Aviv, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. And you shall offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God from the flock or from the herd, at the place that the Lord will choose, to make his name dwell there. You shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat it with unleavened bread, the bread of affliction. That word is humiliation in the Hebrew. For you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, that all the days of your life you may remember the day when you came out of the land of Egypt. It's personal. When we look at statement number 2, the Marurim, we also see again that we're delineating between this night and all other nights, in the eating of many vegetables and the eating just of the maror. Now, maror is bitter herbs, and typically we use horseradish for that. Horseradish has got a very biting sort of flavor to it. It'll clear out your sinuses better than most anything else. And we know that it's associated with the time in Egypt and the bitterness of the slavery that one was in while we were in Egypt. Now, we should also recognize that it's not just the slavery of Egypt, but it's the slavery to sin that is the bitter herb. John chapter 8, verse 34 says, Jesus replied, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin." When we look at the word for burdens, which is sivlot in the Hebrew, what we find is an interesting association with another word which means patience, sivlanot. And there's this concept that the sages have that part of the issue for the Hebrews was that while they were in Egypt, they were willing, they were patient to accept whatever burdens were placed upon them, and that this is not necessarily a good place to be. And it's a way by which we self-burden ourselves and self-enslave ourselves to maintain ourselves within Egypt or the world. Now, when we think of the bitter herbs, we should recognize that there's a full spectrum of emotions to experience. And that if we shut off one area of emotion, we shut them all off. And this is the other association that we have with the bitter herbs. And here, the insight is that if we avoid the pain and shut out the pain, we will also, by very nature, shut off the joy and shut off the other experiences and emotions of life. So we can't be indifferent, and we can't be apathetic, and we certainly can't be one of those individuals who all of us have met at one time or another, who is an assassin of joy. The Hebrews actually were pretty good at staying in this realm of bitterness. Remember that there at the Red Sea, as Pharaoh was being held in the wadi by the pillar of fire, and the night had descended, so the new day had started, the first day of the week, the people were clamoring against Moses. And they said to him, "What, did you drag us out into the desert, into the wilderness, just so that you could kill us out here, so Pharaoh could kill us?" This would be a common theme for them, that inability to let go of their bitterness, and their inability to let go of their desire to still be in Egypt. Later, they would complain bitterly that they didn't have meat, and though they were slaves, and though they were starving, and though they were struggling to put food on the table, they would wax poetic about these wonderful meals that they remember in Egypt, and they would ask the Lord for meat. Careful what you ask for the quail that he sends to them, of course, will be a point of trouble for them. But that doesn't keep them from complaining about the manna. In fact, they complain so bitterly about the manna that God sends the fiery serpents to bite them. And it's only by looking upon this brass serpent that has been put on the stake that they have any chance of salvation from the death from the fiery serpents. What we see is that if you can't taste the maror, if you can't taste the bitterness, you can't taste the freedom. And you cannot leave and will not leave Egypt. So in many ways, the maror is to shake or wake us up, to get our taste buds going again so that we can experience the fullness of what God has for us, both the bitterness but also the joys, and also the freedom. We must remember and experience again the freedom when we were rescued from sin, and remember the state that we were in when we were a slave to sin. Statement number 3 is about the dipping. That in all nights we do not dip even one time. On this night, however, we dip twice. It's interesting to me that when you look at what the Jewish sages have talked about in regards to the dipping, it's not the obvious question, but it's one that's much easier to answer. And what they tend to address is what to dip as opposed to why to dip. So the conventional thought is that the dipping, and they break this into two, you have the parsley and the salt water, reminiscent of the tears, hearkening back to when Joseph's brothers took him and stripped him of his coat and killed the goat, and then proceeded to dip Joseph's coat into the blood to take back to their father. Now, they sold Joseph into slavery. He would go off to Egypt, which is how they would eventually come, and all of Israel would eventually come to be living in Egypt. But the first dipping is referred back to this. The second dipping refers back to the dipping of the hyssop's branch, which is then used to take the blood of the lamb to paint the door sills and jamb of the doors, so that God would pass over the Hebrews. Now, as much as there was disunity between Joseph and his brothers back when they sold Joseph into slavery, the bundling of the hyssop branch is used to show the unity that Israel now has in their service to God. And when we look at what is dipped to commemorate this, it is the horseradish with the harisset. The harisset is made from apples and nuts and a little bit of wine, a number of different other ingredients that they can be put into it as well. But it's the combination of the two, frequently taken in what we would call a Hallel sandwich, where a piece of matzah is placed, there's a mixture of the horseradish and the harisset, and then another piece of matzah on top to partake of this dipping. Now, the reason that is given for the apples is hearkening back to the slavery that was had in Egypt and the heavy burdens that were placed and the weeping that would occur in association with that. And here, the second dipping of the horseradish in the harisset is supposed to hearken back to the mortar that they were required to make in order to construct the buildings of Egypt. Now, the apples, as it turns out, is then told to us by the sages that there were two reasons that it was included for the harisset. The first being that when Egyptians told the Hebrews that they could not be having children, they would sneak off into the apple orchards in order to know their wives and thereby father children. The second reason had to do with the fact that when the Hebrew women drew near to the time to give birth, they would go into the apple orchards to actually give birth, and that they would do so quietly so that the Egyptians would not know what they were doing. And that would be the low-hanging fruit. But it doesn't really answer the question of why dipping this night only and no other nights. What I would point out is that the nature of Passover is exclusive. They don't dip any other night at all. And it's just on Passover that they dip, and they dip twice. Now, Yeshua is our Paschal lamb. And what we see that there's two aspects to this. There's a national aspect in which the Hebrews were extracted out of Egypt, and that you and I and all those that belong to God, all those that are children of Abraham by faith, are extracted out of the world. And then there's the individual aspect. It wasn't just some group of people that were extracted out of Egypt. It was me. It was me who was extracted out of sin and out of my slavery to sin. And it was you. And it is every believer that is yet to come who will be extracted on a personal level. When we look at the fourth statement having to do with reclining, that in all other nights some eat and drink sitting with others reclining, but on this night we are all reclining. Again, we have that differentiation between this night and all other nights, and between sitting with others and reclining and just reclining on this night. So the question becomes, who reclines? And the answer to that is that it's the kings who recline, and the very important people. Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 to 6 say, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice," that's your doublet of Shema, if in Shemaing you will Shema, "and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all people, For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, to proclaim the virtues of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." In Revelation chapter 1, verses 5 to 6, Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead and the ruler of kings on earth, to him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood and made us a kingdom, priests to his God and Father, to him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. So you see, this Paschal season is a season that is set apart from the rest of the days. And it's a season that culminates in Shavuot. You cannot separate out these things, and we should not separate out these things. The night of Pesach is different from all other nights. The Chag Matzah is different from every other week of the year. There's a different Matzah, and we talk about it as the bread of humiliation. We have Aviv first fruits, where a different minchah is required to be brought on that day. We have the counting of the Omer. No other counting or recounting is required for the rest of the year. But here we are told to look back, not just at the experience of the extraction out of Egypt, but those 50 days that take us from the crossing of the Red Sea to the giving of the law, which would foretend the 50 days between the resurrection of Yeshua and the giving of the Holy Spirit. And of course, Shavuot, a new minchah representing a new covenant that requires chametz, requires leaven. But that's a tale for a different day. The four questions, the matzah, the bitter herbs, the double dipping, and the reclining, these things all point to Yeshua. They point to the affliction that he took for you and for me, his sinless sacrifice as the matzah without chametz. They point to the bitterness that we had in sin and our desire to stay there. They point to the freedom that we are afforded by Yeshua, not just collectively as children of Abraham, but personally for you and for me. And they help us to remember that we have been brought out of Egypt as if on eagle's wings to one day take our place ruling and reigning with HaMashiach as his kingdom of priests and his holy nation. Blessings to you all.